From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, I am Estefania Bravo. This is From the South. Vote counting has officially begun in South Africa as the country held its most hard-fought general elections since the end of apartheid. All voting stations have now closed following some delays earlier in some parts of the country due to the weather and protests in some parts. About 26 million registered voters were eligible to cast their ballots at more than 22,000 polling stations. Early results will emerge on Thursday with an official winner declared on Saturday. The Economic Freedom Fighters Party has alleged that some people have voted twice or even 3 times in this election. It said some elderly voters who cast their ballot in the special vote on Monday went to vote again on Wednesday. There were also reports of some voters rubbing off the indelible ink and heading to other polling stations to vote again. The Independent Electoral Commission has vowed to take stern action. Our correspondent, Matua Malachi, is in Pretoria and provides us with a roundup of how the election day went.
Polling stations around South Africa have been officially closed, and that's according to the Independent Electoral Commission of South Africa, but saying that people who are still queuing outside polling stations should be allowed to vote. And we expect to see voting stations to close until very late on Wednesday evening, because some polling stations opened 5 hours after the official opening time, which was 7 a.m. Central African time. 5 hours after that, there were polling stations that were still not open due to various issues, including protests, service delivery protests, and logistical issues. So we expect to see polling stations to be still open even after midnight tonight. But the process that will follow the closing of polling stations, it will be vote counting. So vote counting will happen once all the polling stations are closed. Party agents alongside electoral officers will start counting the votes and verifying them, and those numbers will be sent to the main election center where everything is centralized, and we'll start seeing numbers trickling in from then. We don't expect to see results in the next 8-9 hours or any projections for that matter, because as I've said, some polling stations really started late, but 90% of polling stations were opened on time on Wednesday morning. But it remains to be seen if they will catch up and start counting the ballots, and we'll start seeing projections by at least Friday, because we know on Saturday we expect to hear the announcement of the winner of this election. And this is one of the most unpredictable elections because it had a record of more than 40 parties competing for seats in parliament and in the provincial legislatures here in South Africa. So this was one of the most contentious elections, as analysts have put it. But now we wait and see for the next process, and the IEC, that is the Electoral Commission, will make an official announcement on whether vote counting has officially started or not. But at this point, that is what we expect to happen after polling stations have closed at 9 p.m. Central African time on Wednesday.
We thank Matua for that update. And while voting proceeded smoothly in most parts of the country, police in the Northern Cape province used rubber bullets and tear gas to disperse a group of residents who attempted to disrupt the polls. The chaos started when residents who were boycotting the elections tried to prevent others from voting. The boycott is over what they say is the government's failure to deliver basic services such as water and sanitation. Land reform, corruption, and unemployment were key issues in this 6th Democratic National election since apartheid ended 25 years ago. Our special contributor, Johan Abrahams, has more.
The rain came down in buckets in parts of Cape Town, South Africa this morning as people came out to vote in the national and provincial elections. Most of them saw it as a blessing on the 25 years since the first all-race democratic elections in April 1994. Ayanda Holo travelled more than 1,000 kilometers to vote in the town he grew up in. For him, it was a homecoming laced with nostalgia.
Nyanga East is not only a township and a location, but it's an institution that is filled with history and a clear contribution of sweat and tears and people sacrificing their lives to ensure that one day we enjoy a democratic vote and a democratic and a free society.
But Nyanga is also a town plagued by unemployment and rampant crime, and reflects the difficult road facing South Africa despite its great democracy. Holo says if you look beyond the label of violence, it's also a place filled with hope. Those that came to vote share his optimism.
We have never ever given up hope, and we were fortunate enough because we do have a program at the Nyanga Art Center which is called the Artisan School. The Artisan School teaches art and culture as part of the curriculum in schools.
More than 26 million South Africans are registered to vote, and 48 political parties are contesting the elections. One of those that came to vote is still seeking justice for her brother that was killed shortly after his return from Robben Island.
We still have not found closure to the assassination of my late brother, Mziwonke Project. Since Pro's death, we were failed by a number of institutions, starting from the TRC.
Despite the hardships, residents of Nyanga, together with fellow South Africans, remain hopeful and continue to keep the dream alive of a better tomorrow. Johan Abrams for Talisur in Nyanga, Cape Town, South Africa.
The president of Venezuela Supreme Court, Michael Moreno, has said that the court rejects the threats made by the U.S. against Venezuelan institutions.
The Supreme Court judges of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela absolutely reject the threats made by Mr. Mike Pence, who has threatened the high magistrates in a disrespectful and interventionist way, with threats that violate the principles of independence, sovereignty, and the self-determination of countries.
And also, Venezuela's National Constituent Assembly has taken away the immunity of 7 lawmakers over the recent attempted coup d'etat. This comes after the Supreme Court of Justice asked the Constituent Assembly to lift the immunity of the opposition lawmakers, including Henry Ramos Ayub, former president of the National Assembly. Now proceedings could be opened against them over crimes such as conspiracy, treason, and rebellion. The Cuban charge d'affaires in Brazil, Rolando Gomez, has condemned U.S. threats and blackmail at a news conference. He said the U.S. is threatening Cuba for supporting Venezuela and standing against military intervention.
It must be clear that the U.S. slander relies on a total and deliberate lie. Their intelligence services have enough evidence, for sure more than any other country, to know that Cuba does not have troops or participate in military or security operations in Venezuela, despite the fact that it would be a sovereign right of 2 independent countries to determine how they cooperate in defense, and neither the US nor any other country have the right to question it.
And Venezuela's Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza has denounced the United States interventionism. On Twitter, he said the recent statements and actions by members of the U.S. government verified what we have been saying since January 26th at the Security Council. Washington is not behind the coup, it is ahead. It is leading, planning, and executing it at every step. Cuba's President Miguel Díaz-Canel also spoke about the U.S. threats. He said that the statements by members of the U.S. government against Cuba and Venezuela have the same purpose and are part of the perverse, arrogant, and Monronist plan of the Empire of the North. The dignified peoples will defend independence and sovereignty, he said. And the Mexican Foreign Ministry has published a communique rejecting the application of Article 3 of the Helms-Burton Law. It says that the legislation endorses specific actions to strengthen the United States' economic, commercial, and financial blockade on the Republic of Cuba. It adds that since the law came into force in 1996, the U.S. had suspended Title III, which permits U.S. citizens to sue over property confiscated by the Cuban government since January 1st, 1959. Mexico said that the application of the Helms-Burton contradicts international law. The country said it would protect Mexican businesses that could be affected. Two people were killed after a shooting during a demonstration in Mexico City. A man opened fire on a crowd of sales and business people who were holding a protest in the south of the capital. One of the victims was a labor union leader. Two other demonstrators were also injured. The attacker was arrested shortly after opening fire. Mexican authorities are investigating the reasons behind the attack. Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador says his government is making the fight against corruption a priority. The government has launched a new plan to stop thieves from stealing medicine from public institutions, a crime that has hurt patients for years now.
People who use public healthcare have been complaining about the continued lack of medical supplies and medicines in the clinics and public hospitals across Mexico.
I have to buy a very expensive medicine, but I need it, so I have to buy it, even though my health insurance does not cover it.
In an attempt to figure out the real size of the problem and who is most affected, social organizations have created the platform No to the Stealing of Medicine. Their goal is to identify those responsible for the shortage and the corruption networks that have benefited from it over the years.
According to a 2016 national survey about public health insurance, 24% of the people do not have enough medicine.
The president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, decided to concentrate all government purchases in the finance ministry, including medicines, for the entire health sector. That measure has caused shortages of some medicines due to the delay in the bidding process.
There was a delay in the purchase of medicines because they were trying to get a better price. Unfortunately, more than 97,000 people had real problems due to the shortage. For instance, our comrades in Tamaulipas are currently without antiretrovirals, and in Ciudad Juárez, people are receiving medicines only for 10 days.
The measure was useful to eliminate corruption, according to the president, who assured that the supply is guaranteed.
We have signed an accord with the UN to accompany us in all our medicines purchases. But at the same time, all the companies that sold us medicines are so ingrained in the country that it is difficult to find other ones. For instance, one of these companies is the only one that supplies us medicine for HIV, so I had to make an exception with that one. But we are looking for other companies to work with around the world.
According to a government audit, the health system is one of the most susceptible to embezzlement. The government of former President Enrique Peña Nieto had irregularities of more than $166 million.
We'll be back very soon. Stay with us. Welcome back. After 8 days of walking, the March for Dignity, Peace and Justice is close to arriving to the capital of Guatemala. Marchers restarted their pilgrimage at 7 a.m. on Wednesday after spending the night on a highway leading to the city. They set off from different departments in the country and expect to arrive soon to the capital. The march is condemning the criminalization and persecution of social leaders and land rights activists. Around 1,500 people have taken part in the march, which set off from the town of Quetzaltenango on May 1st. Our correspondent Mario Rosales has more from Guatemala City.
We're on the outskirts of Guatemala City, waiting for the March of Dignity. This march began on May 1st in the western department of Quetzaltenango. Hundreds of campesinos and indigenous citizens are arriving to the city to claim respect for their communities and reject the criminalization of social leaders. They're also demanding that President Jimmy Morales stop the Criminal Alliance, an agreement in which the president, his ministers, and some other sectors keep quiet about acts of corruption. They also want respect for their lands, for natural resources, and above all, respect for indigenous and campesino authorities. This group has already walked almost 250 kilometers in order to arrive here and make sure their demands are heard.
We thank Mario Rosales for that report. Belizeans are voting in a referendum on the decades-old territorial dispute with Guatemala. Voters are to decide whether Belize should take its border dispute with its Central American neighbor to the International Court of Justice. The territory of Belize has been claimed in whole or in part by Guatemala since 1821, the colonial era. While there have been several attempts to settle this dispute with no final resolution, several problems both on the land and sea still exist. Trinidad and Tobago's police commissioner says the bullet that fatally struck a 14-year-old girl during a police shootout with an alleged criminal gang was not fired by his officers. The autopsy report for the teenage victim, Naomi Nelson, concluded that she was shot to the back of her head. It's unclear whether the teenager was running away from the shooter or if she was a casualty of a stray bullet. But the police commissioner says investigations have revealed that his officers are not to blame and they were forced to defend their lives.
Look at where the police vehicle was. Point again, please. The police vehicle, where would he have fired? Up north, towards the X on top. The X on top is who they shot at. The X on top, point at the X on top again, please. They fired towards the police vehicle. What is behind the police vehicle? The young lady.
Do you believe an alternate action could have been taken? Perhaps they could have tried to stop the fire.
Yes, no, agreed. Yeah, because if the person was shooting at the police officer, he should have done a matrix and spun around and then seized the weapon. You watch too many movies, so if someone is firing a gunshot at you and firing, the only thing you could do to save your life is to fire back. You watch too many Avengers movies. It doesn't work that way.
At least 12 people have been killed in the Democratic Republic of Congo after a clash between government troops and rebel forces. Most of the victims were the Mai Mai militia. In response to the violence, the health ministry has issued an order suspending all the activities of Ebola response workers in the town until further notice.
For obvious security reasons, the United Nations Security Service has suspended all movements of personnel working in this area, where many people are currently deployed. Because, as you know, it's also an area, an epicenter also for the Ebola virus.
The World Health Organization says Libya's capital Tripoli is at risk for outbreaks of deadly diseases, including cholera. The organization says most displaced people are living in crowded places with poor sanitation and contaminated water. At least 60,000 people have fled the fighting between the UN-recognized government and the Libyan National Army in the southern outskirts.
These supplies can cater for 3 to 4 weeks or a month. But if there is no ceasefire and there is no reduction in the scale and scope and intensity of the conflict, even if it goes by the current intensity, these supplies will run out of, we will run out of these supplies.
In Nigeria, 9 people have been killed in 2 separate Boko Haram attacks. Fighters packed in trucks stormed into the village of Umolai just before sunset on Tuesday as villagers were preparing to pray and break their fast for the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. They killed 6 people and burned dozens of homes. In the other attack, Boko Haram fighters ambushed and killed 3 farmers near the town of Kunduga. Sudanese protest leaders have threatened the ruling military council with more civil disobedience. Speaking in a press conference on Wednesday, Sudanese protest leaders accused the country's military rulers of delaying the transfer of power to a civilian administration. They're vowing to launch a new phase of nationwide demonstrations. Thousands of people remain camped outside the military headquarters in Khartoum. The 10-member military council late on Tuesday said it agreed to overall proposals but had, quote, many reservations.
We warned the military council of the continued escalation against the activists and demonstrators who are gathering in the street. Incidents in recent days have been recurrent, beginning with the incident of Nayala, which resulted in the death of a martyr.
Meanwhile, some protesters in Sudan have turned to art, comedy, and music to express themselves. At an ongoing sit-in in Khartoum, they have gone from using graffiti on the walls and holding concerts to holding mock press briefings on the situation. Ethiopia's garment workers are the world's lowest paid, a study has reported. Ethiopia's clothes factory workers producing items for top fashion brands, including Guess, H&M, and Calvin Klein, are the worst paid in the world, earning only $26 a month, according to a report released on Tuesday. The report by the New York University Stern Center for Business and Human Rights said the country does not have an official minimum wage for the private sector. This facilitates the exploitation of labor by the world's global companies. We'll be back very soon. Stay with us. Welcome back. The opposition Pheu Thai Party has won the most seats in Thailand's first election since a military coup in 2014. The party picked up 136 seats, while the ruling Pracharath Party took 115. However, the 250-seat Senate is expected to back the ruling party, giving them an advantage in their bid to stay in power. The results have been announced more than a month after the election, which was marred by delays and complaints of irregularities. The president of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Hassan Rouhani, has announced that his country will abandon part of the commitments made in the nuclear agreement between Tehran and the G5+1 and has given 60 days for negotiations. Rouhani said that it was a necessary measure to protect national security and the Iranian people, who are facing extensive sanctions applied by the U.S. President Donald Trump. Rouhani also pointed to the failure of Europe to comply with the agreed program.
In the message we've delivered to 5 countries, we've said very clearly that if they use the steps that they've taken as an excuse to refer Iran to the United Nations Security Council, they will be given a very firm answer. I've explained the steps involved in this firm response in the letter sent to the 5 countries. Our intention is clear. Our people must know that we haven't left the nuclear agreement. The Iranian people shouldn't think that the agreement isn't still in place. The agreement is there and will stay in place. But today, we've shown the other side of the G5+1 coin. This is the same nuclear agreement that says that if others don't comply with their obligations, then we can also reduce our own obligations. Today, we are announcing a reduction of obligations. We aren't leaving the nuclear agreement.
Drivers for ride-hailing apps that are seeking to replace conventional taxi services have gone on strike across the globe. Workers at companies like Uber are demanding better pay, transparency, and support. The company is paying its executive millions of dollars while workers are struggling to make ends meet. The apps have also been embroiled in legal scandals across the world because they classify their drivers as self-employed. Doing so means they have fewer legal responsibilities for employee welfare. The strike has received attention from political figures like U.S. presidential candidate Bernie Sanders. He said he stands in solidarity with those on strike for a dignified life. In the United Kingdom, Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn offered his support, saying Uber cannot be allowed to get away with huge payouts to CEOs while refusing to pay drivers a decent wage. And drivers were also on strike in Brazil as Uber prepares for its initial public offering on Friday. The company expects to be valued at $90 billion, and the disparity between that valuation and drivers' pay is a cause of grave concern for many.
What concerns us, in a political way, is showing that if they don't respect us, who are their partners? Who allows them to function? If they don't respect us, who is going to guarantee that they will respect investors? Knowing all the necessary compliance with corporate management and everything else. If they don't respect us, who is going to guarantee that they will obey those rules of the financial markets?
Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel has met several business leaders who attended a tourism fair in Havana. This is a major event for the tourism sector in the region. The 39th edition of the fair opened its doors on Tuesday and it will last until May 11th. Cuban authorities said the companies have total legal security as the U.S. intensifies its blockade against the country. And with that story, we've come to the end of this news brief. These and other stories, as always, find them on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also join us on social media. We are on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram. For Telesur English, I am